Welcome to Sing Smart class number 3. I trust that you have had a good week and have made time to review our first 2 sessions. For this session, you will need your textbook and handouts, actually number 6 through number 11 for this session. Number 6 and 7 are handouts that you should have received last week, but we will review parts of them again this week. Our session today covers scales, intervals, chords, and cadences. We will also spend some time sight singing. That's if I don't talk too much on the way to the end of this session. You should read page 75 through 112 of your text in support and in review of this class. I begin with scales and modes. A mode is any of several ways of ordering the notes of a scale according to the intervals they form with the tonic. I'm going to say that one more time because it's a lot to absorb as you hear it. A mode or a scale is any of several ways of ordering the notes of a scale according to the intervals they form with the tonic. Remember, the tonic is the first note or the home note of the scale. A scale or mode is a series of pitches in a distinct order. These notes provide a theoretical framework for the melody. A mode is the vocabulary used to create the melodic line. It not only specifies which notes are used, but it also helps to establish which notes have special importance, like the home tone, or the leading tone, or the dominant. Musical modes have been a part of Western musical thought since the Middle Ages and were inspired by the theory of ancient Greek music. The name mode derives from the Latin word modus, meaning a standard, a measure, a form, a manner, a way, a method. We discussed how Western music composed prior to the 20th century does not use all 12 notes from the equal temperament, but are mostly commonly centered around the major and the minor scales, which only use 7 tones. We spent time in our last session studying intervals like these tetrachords, and we're going to review just for a moment the tetrachords in a major scale, right up here. This was from last session, remembering that 2 tetrachords that are exactly alike, connected by a whole step, and with the pattern of, these are your notes, a starting note, a whole step, half, connected by a whole step with another whole step, half, create a major scale. You should know that from our last session. The tonic, also called the keynote or the home note, creates a sort of gravitation. It becomes a note on which the music can rest. Tunes often begin and almost always end on the tonic. Last week, we also looked at the technical names for other notes of a scale. I'd like to review these just for a moment because you'll hear them again in this lecture. We talked about the tonic, the home tone, the center of the scale, the main note of the scale. Supertonic meaning super above, so the second degree of the scale is the supertonic. The median is a third above the tonic. If you go down to the 6th, the submedian would be a third under the tonic. The other 2 most important ones are the dominant and the subdominant. Realizing that the dominant is built on the 5th note of the scale, remember our circle of fifths. That continues to come back in our study of theory. The subdominant is a 5th below the tonic. I always thought the subdominant was under the dominant, but the truth is the subdominant is so named because it's a 5th under the tonic. We've already talked about the submedian being a third under the tonic, and the leading tone is so named because it functions as a note that leads up to the tonic. It pushes us back to this home note, which is the tonic number 8 or number 1, back to the octave to that. So I review those just because I think that you need to understand the major scale and the degrees so that we can move forward into other kinds of scales. For every major key, there is an equivalent minor key or scale, which will have the exact same notes, the exact same accidentals. I like to think of it as the exact same blood. It is called the relative minor. A relative has the same blood, most times anyway, and so it's called the relative minor, exact same notes. It's also called the natural minor scale. It has a different tonal center, and the different tonal center completely changes the mood of the scale. I'm going to show you this. I'm going to play a C major scale for you. Let's not mock that. We're in C major. If I go down to the related minor, I'm going to play the exact same notes, but I'm going to begin on an A. The whole feeling of that scale is changed only by the tonal center. And that is called the natural minor or the relative minor. Same key signature, same notes. You know, you'll hear people say that pieces composed in a major key or mode often seem happy, and pieces composed in a minor mode feel sad. That's really a broad generalization, but it does have some merit because they do have different feelings, and you're going to find that many modes, each mode creates its own feeling, and as we get into more modern modes. How do we find the related minor? There are a couple of ways. If you count down 3 half steps from the major note, the major tonic note, you will discover the relative minor for that scale. I was playing a C scale. That's 1, 2, 3 half steps down. My poor old piano teacher, bless her soul, Miss Mathis, we had theory classes, and she started every theory class asking the question about how you find the minor, the relative minor of a major scale. And she played that minor third down over and over. I can still hear going. I hope you remember that. There is another way to identify the relative minor. If you look at the circle of fifths. Now, Miss Calfee made us a gorgeous circle of fifths, and this is her experimental one, so I didn't feel so guilty drawing on it. Your book says that one of the ways, and it's an interesting way, if you take C with no sharps or flats, and you move down 3, or move forward, I guess I should say, 3 different patterns, you will come, the yellow line takes us to A. C major is related to A minor. We've written this inside as well. There's something I like about this and something I don't like about this. When you see C major taking you down to A minor, to A, I see 3 sharps in A, which is the major key signature for A. C goes to A minor with the same blood. G, count up 3, this is kind of the purple line, would take you to E. And that if you go down the 3 half steps, you're a lot safer that way. I'll show you where the circle of fifths idea does help a little bit, but to me it's a little bit confusing. This is a good time to share the term modulation. Modulation is when a piece of music changes from one key to another. The closer the keys are to each other on the circle of fifths, the more common notes they have with each other. Remember, in the circle of fifths, this is, say, a C scale. This begins the next scale, the G scale. So these first 4 notes of the next scale on the circle are identical to the last 4 notes of the previous scale. So you can see how connected they are. So you have a lot of common tones, which can help you to modulate into the next key. Most modulations build the new tonic on the subdominant. We've talked about the subdominant, based on the 4th note of the scale, or the dominant, based on the 5th note of the scale. There again, that 5 is an important interval, an important number in music theory. But it can also move to the relative minor or the relative major. You can see why it can easily move to the relative minor because it's the same notes, except the home tone transfers down to the minor key. It can also shift to the relative major easily because you're only changing a note or so to get into that major 1 chord of the relative minor. I actually did this in church today. I was playing Morning is Broken, and it is, I'm in the key of F, and if I'd stayed in F, I'd been here, but I went, and then I went into the key of D major. Well, D minor is the relative minor, but D major was an easy shift. It's a little bit of a surprise, but it's an easy one to do in a modulation. Enough about that. You know what modulation means, but it can shift. And if keys are changed in a piece of music, it's helpful for you to realize that. Maybe even notate it in your score so that you know what's happening musically in the piece. Let's get back to minor scales. There are actually 2 additional variations on the minor mode, the harmonic and the melodic. If you understand how and why they were developed, they are quite easy to grasp, I think. There's a slight problem with the natural minor scale in that the 7th note of the leading tone is now a whole step away from the tonic. Now, I'm going to play the A minor 7, and that, whereas if it were, where's that headed? I don't have to play. Your ear will just automatically take you to that. So one of the things the natural minor does is to raise that 7th degree so that the leading tone is now a half step away from the octave or the tonic. The other thing that happens in the relative minor is when you play a cadence in the relative minor, a cadence is a group of chords, a chord progression that take you back home. We'll talk about cadences later today, but and listen to this note. That takes you nowhere. It can go anywhere. It can go all over the place. If you have that raised 7th, which was the leading tone that we are already going to do for one reason, that's going to take you right back to the minor, the A minor chord, the A minor tonic chord. So it was developed, called the harmonic minor scale, and it was developed because of the leading tone and because of the dominant chord needed that 7th in there. So when you're playing something in the key of A minor, which is the same key signature as C major, which is all white notes, you're going to find a lot of G sharps in it. G sharp is the note that will be your leading tone. So as a singer, you need to think that note as high as you can. Push it up over the top and lead people back into the tonic of the A minor for that. Now, there is another problem created by this, and that is, let's see if I can find where we are. I've already told you all this about the harmonic. The new problem is that in the harmonic minor, because we've raised the 7th degree, we now have a step and a half between the 6th and 7th degree. So watch this. So we have F, F sharp, G to G sharp. So we've got a step and a half, which is really too far. You know, if you're playing a scale, so that doesn't sound exactly like a very inviting scale. So what happened, because remember we said that the scale creates the vocabulary for the melodic line. So we raised the 6th degree and the 7th degree in a melodic scale. So what we have, and lower it back to the natural minor coming down as we descend. So that scale, instead of having 7 tones, now has 9 tones. And what that does is it increases your vocabulary for the melodic line in that minor key. So we have now a natural minor or a relative minor. We have the harmonic minor, which is for harmonic purposes, basically. And we have the melodic minor, which raises 6 and 7 going up and plays the natural minor on its way down, adding 2 notes to that. I've told you all that. The oldest medieval treatise regarding modes. Modes. They date between 795 and 800 AD. These go back a long way. And I have to admit that in my research, I found out there's a whole lot more about modes than I ever knew about. I was taught modern modes, and that's where we're going to end up. But I do think it's important for you to realize that these modes began many, many moons ago. Various interpretations of the character imparted by the different modes have been suggested. Within the ancient Greek modes, moods or modes range from pious, happy, sad, serious, cheerful, mystic, inciting anger, tender, inciting delights, and tempting fierceness. The full gamut. We have already suggested that some feel that a major key or mode tends to be joyful, and that a minor key or mode tends to create a serious or more tearful feeling. One can now understand just why composers selected modes that would speak to the mood of the composition they were trying to create. Because of equal temperament, composers also transpose keys within the modes to create warmth or brightness. Even within our major and minor modes, composers, I think, select the key of their compositions by the mood of the composition. The key of C major is kind of a dull key. It really is, it's not flat, but it's dull. And if you go to the key of D major, listen to a C major scale. Listen to a D major. It has a little more brightness. And that takes a fine ear to discern, but some of your finest composers will listen to the different keys and envision what they're trying to create and select either a warm key or a bright key or a calm key. And to them, I've even heard of people seeing different colors with the different keys. I can't go that far, but there are people that will say that. The names of the ancient Greek modes are derived from ancient Greek regions. The subgroup, the Dorians, the Dorians lived in a small region in central Greece. Locris and certain neighboring people, non-Greek, but related to them from Asia Minor, Lydia, Phrygia. These were all little towns. And the ancient Greek modes were based on the names of the little towns where these developed. Now, the names of modern modes are still Greek, and some have the same names used in the ancient Greek theory. The names of the modern modes are conventional and do not indicate a link between them and the ancient Greek theory. They do not present the sequence or intervals found even the diatonic genus of the Greek octave species, sharing the same name. So the modern modes, even though they have the Greek names, are not totally related to the modal applications in early times. Let's move on into the modern modes, because this is how we think of modes in today. By the early 19th century, the modern Western modes came to consist merely of 7 scales, related to the familiar major and minor keys. They use the same set of notes as major scales, in the same order, but starting from one of its 7 degrees, in turn as a tonic. So they present a different sequence of whole and half steps. Now, let's find this chart. It may be right in front of me. Am I on modes up here? Yes. The modern modes. The Ionian mode, we're going to use all white notes. If you played from C to C, you see this is our major scale pattern. Whole step, half, connected by a whole step, half. The Ionian mode and the C major scale, or the major scale, is the same grouping of intervals. I'll show you another interesting one. The Aeolian mode, based on the 6th note of the scale. Remember, we went down 3 half steps to the 6th degree to create the natural minor. And this is the natural minor mode. It's also called the Aeolian mode. We go up to the Dorian mode, which begins on D. Now, if you hear a Dorian mode, you know, it changes the home tone just like the minor scale did. It's a totally different scale, and people still compose in these modes. Then you have, built on the 3, the Phrygian. And it's, again, you have built on the 4th, which would be the Lydian. The 4th of an F scale is natural. The Mixolydian, the 7th is down. You hear the difference? And then we get to the Aeolian, which is the 6th one, which is our natural minor scale. And then you get to the 7th, the Locrian, which is totally bizarre. So it rearranges the tonic or the home tone, and it rearranges the intervals between the notes. So they have a totally different feel than your major and minor scales, basically, and yet they're related, and yet they're easy to find. You need to memorize these titles, 1 through 7. Get on it. That's not that hard to do, that hard. For the sake of simplicity, the examples that I've given you are formed by the natural notes or the white notes, and they can be, you can play them just like I did to hear the differences. However, you need to know that transposition of any of these scales is valid, and it's a valid example of the corresponding mode. In other words, as long as you keep the intervals correct, you can transpose this into any key. You just have to keep the intervals correct, and you would be performing or playing in that mode. When I think about a lot of modal music, we did the Duruflé Requiem, and I think of modes in the Duruflé Requiem because it goes back to the chant some, and that certainly used modes historically. Additional scales also developed, the pentatonic being a very important one. The pentatonic scale is a musical scale with 5 notes per octave, in contrast to the heptatonic scale, which has the 7 notes per octave, like our major and minor. The major pentatonic scale may be thought of as a gapped or incomplete major scale. However, the pentatonic scale has a unique character and is complete in terms of tonality. Construction takes 5 consecutive pitches from the circle of fifths. Here we go, back to that circle of fifths. It takes the 5, beginning with C. C, G, D, A, and E. C, G, D, A, and E create a pentatonic scale. Now, you can transpose these pitches into 1 octave, which is the way I think about a pentatonic scale, and it rearranges them into C, D, E, G, A, or the fun thing about a pentatonic scale, and one of the things that makes it so accessible and easy to teach, is that on a keyboard, if you begin on a G flat, it's now transposed to the black notes. But you can use 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 of any major scale and find the pentatonic scale. I often tell people that don't know anything about keyboard to make up anything on the black notes. You can't play a wrong note in the pentatonic scale. You know, you can play any kind of, might sound Chinese. It doesn't matter what you play. It works. It's a good scale for that. So I think that's partly why it develops so easily. There is a minor pentatonic scale. I don't see much use in that in literature. I'm not saying, but I want you to know that it does exist. The term is most commonly applied to the relative minor pentatonic, which uses the scale tones 1, 3, 4, 5, and 7 of the natural minor scale. It's not one that jumps out as something that's often used, but the major pentatonic is all over the place. The major pentatonic scales were developed independently by many ancient civilizations and are still used in various musical styles and in many traditions, even today. Major pentatonic scale is the basic scale for the music of China, Korea, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, Japan, Greece, Vietnam. In Scottish music, the pentatonic scale is also very common. It has been suggested that the Great Highland Bagpipe Scale, with its augmented 4th and diminished 7th, is a device that can produce, by adding those couple of notes, can produce as many pentatonic scales as possible because they only have 9 notes in their ability to, they can only perform 5 notes on a bagpipe. You'll often hear Amazing Grace on a bagpipe because you can play Amazing Grace on the black notes. Totally. It's a total pentatonic scale. That's why Amazing Grace is often played by the bagpipes. Irish music uses the pentatonic scale. In the United States, bluegrass music, jazz, blues, rock music all use the pentatonic scale, and we don't even realize it's happening. American Indians on the Pacific Northwest use the pentatonic scale. And it was being created all over the world in different places. It just was so accessible somehow to people. Western Impressionistic composer, French composer Claude Debussy, created music with the pentatonic scale. It also had a huge role in education, still does today. The pentatonic scale plays a significant role in the education, particularly in ORF-based or Kodály-based methodologies at the primary and elementary school level. The ORF system places heavy emphasis on developing creativity through improvisation in children, largely through use of this scale. We have got ORF instruments, I should have pulled one out for you, where you can take all the extra notes off and only have the pentatonic scale, or only have a child play on the black notes of a keyboard. And they can improvise and create patterns that can go with pieces. Carl Orff himself believed that the pentatonic scale is the children's native tonality. He really believed that. Another scale that developed that's probably not as important as the pentatonic, because I think other than the major and minor and the modes, the whole tone scale. The whole tone scale is also called the augmented scale. It is, as the name implies, built from notes with intervals of a whole step. This is so-called a symmetrical scale, meaning that the interval is the same throughout the scale. Each note is separated from its neighbor by the interval of a whole step. We studied whole steps and half steps. 2 halves equal a whole. There are only 2 versions of a whole tone scale, one that begins on, say, C, and one that begins on, say, a half step from C. I'll play these for you, and you need to be able to play these and hear these and sing these. Listen. Those are all whole steps. If I started on the C sharp, the only other option I have those are whole tone scales. We ought to be able to sing a whole tone scale. Oh, this is challenging me. When we finally get back together, we have to do some of this to see if you have practiced these. That's a tricky one. Russian Romantic composers introduced the whole tone scales. And Debussy also followed in composing in whole tone scales. As Romanticism grew into Impressionism, whole tone scales or bits of whole tone tonality came into being more and more. Another scale is a chromatic scale. It is, as the name implies, built from notes with intervals of a half step. I cannot really name music that is solely composed on the chromatic scale. The only thing that I could even come up with, do you remember the Flight of the Bumblebee? Those are all chromatic half steps. The rest of the piece may not do it, but that's the best thing I could come up with, and that's not really the greatest example of music, in my opinion, but that's okay. But the chromatic scale is certainly used within other modes to create color, both harmonically and melodically, especially during the peak of Romanticism. You'll find chromaticism, and those are the accidentals that we find beyond the key signature that add the chromaticism that adds color to the melodic and harmonic lines. There's one more that I will mention, and it's called a tone row. Oh my. In music, a tone row or a note row is also a series or a set. It is a non-repetitive ordering of a set of pitch classes. Typically, of all of the 12 notes in musical set theory of the chromatic scale, though both larger and smaller sets are sometimes found. So composers set up this tone row or this pattern of all 12 notes and create their own scale of half notes in a certain order. Schoenberg is the gentleman that comes to my mind for this. Schoenberg, I have to admit, is not one of my favorite composers to listen to. I'll just tell you that. And I doubt that he'd be one of your favorite composers. But he developed this pretty much. And I will say, to listen to his music is not what I want, but to analyze his music, once you establish what the tone row is, and to discover how he put things together to create this, whether he did it inverted or upside down or in a chord or, you know, stacked on top of each other. However he put this tone, this pattern together is quite interesting. So if you get into his brain, the musical genius that he was that could make something out of this is interesting. Not so much for me to listen to, but I'll let you be the judge on that. I believe that it's important for each of us to be able to sing each of these scales, except the tone row maybe. Understanding the mode that a piece is in or the scale will enhance your sight singing invariably. It will make a huge difference in your understanding of what's happening in the music. And so this is why I'm bringing this to you. Enough about modes and scales. Study them, please. As music developed, it became more modern, so our hearing of different sounds became more accepting. Creativity over time modified what we would call constant and what we would call dissonant. Now that takes us to intervals. Here we go. I quote from your text. An interval is the distance between two consecutive notes. Seems pretty easy. The name of an interval depends on the number of notes, letter names, the number of letter names between them that they span. Melodic intervals are played, sung one note at a time, from here to here is an interval. Harmonic intervals are played stacked together like chords. That's all the difference is. Your text correctly states that every interval has a sound of its own. Each interval also has a look of its own as well. I think it's important that you learn to recognize intervals in your scores. And so I'm gonna get away from this for a second, and I'll probably lose my place, but I want to talk to you a little bit about intervals and what they look like. Well, first, I guess I can talk about, let me move over just a bit. Seconds are easy to spot in notation. Here we have what is called a unison. We'll get to that in a second, but seconds are neighbor notes. Seconds are always neighbor notes. You have a line note and a space note. A line note and a space note. They're right smashed together. Remember we talked about staves. They go up on the right, down on the left. You'll see that editors have to spread them out a little. If you put that as a glob together, you can't really see anything but a glob. So you'll find that they are spread out just slightly, seconds are, but rhythmically they're played together. That can be confusing to singers when you've got two parts on a staff and the notes, are they really together or are they separate two different notes? So they're played rhythmically together, but spread out slightly. I'm gonna go on to how I think, and I can only teach you how I think, but a third is a skip. Remember we did this stupid thing, line to line, space to space, line to line, space to space? Well, a skip is either line to line or space to space. A skip is line to line in the third. A skip is a line to line in this scale in the fifth. A skip is a line to line on the seventh. It's always either two line notes together or two space notes together. So it's easy to look at these two notes, whether they're, I drew them harmonically, but if I had drawn them melodically from C to E, you can see that's a line note, that's a line note. They're as close together as a skip can be. That's a third. So you've got a second and a third that are kind of given for you. I call a fifth, excuse me, a double skip, because you've got a skip right here. If you skipped again, you're skipping up 1, 3, 5. So you've got the fifth. It's easy to find. Easy to find, either harmonically or melodically. When you get to the seventh, it's far apart, but you're still on 2 line notes. So that to me tells me that's a seventh. That's a given. If you can remember that, you can sight read a skip from this note to this, or from this note to this, or this note to that, without even thinking, because it's line to line or space to space. So just the opposite of that becomes your second, fourth, sixth, and eighth. You see that because we're skipping, we're going to the seconds, the fourths, the sixths, and the eighths. A second is obvious because they're right next door to each other. A fourth is not quite a double skip, but you see it's a line to a space, so it's easy to recognize that as 4 notes apart. When you get to the seventh, the sixth, excuse me. When you get to the sixth, it's a greater distance, but it's not an octave. You know, I think it's easy to spot an octave on a page because it's about, how many? 1, 2, 3 lines or spaces away. One is a line, one is a space. If you can remember that, it will help you to discern what interval you're trying to read, okay? Now, I've told you that. A couple more facts about intervals I do want to share right now. An interval made up of 2 of the same letter notes, but far apart. Like that's middle C, we know that. And this is F, A, C. This is the octave C. This is called, between this C and this C, or these 2 Cs, is 8 notes apart. It's called an octave. 8 octagon, 8-sided, 8 notes away from each other. That's called an octave. When singing and you happen upon an octave within the harmonic structure of the piece, it's a great place to tune. If the altos are singing middle C and the sopranos are singing high C, boy, those C's better match, because those are consonant kind of intervals that should blend perfectly. And that's a great time to listen to each other and find a way. The other one that I want you to think about is when 2 notes come together and hit 1 note. This middle C, this tiny little middle C that almost is erased right now from my scribbling on it, has a staff going up for a soprano and a staff going down for an alto, say, but it's all on middle C. That's called a unison. Happens to be the home tone in many cases when it happens, but it's called a unison, and that's when multiple voices are on the exact same pitch. And there again, that's a tuning opportunity for you as a chorus. So make sure you understand unisons, octaves. Fifths are another. Fifths just never go out of your life in music theory. They're always a big part of it. So now, we've talked about what they look like. Now we need to talk about what they sound like a little bit. And I'm going to confuse myself a little bit here with this because I have different ideas about how to do this. I'm going to go back to an exercise that we did, I believe, in the last session. And we did 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I want to go back to that little exercise. Those were basically singing intervals of a major scale. And I think it's important to know the intervals of a major scale just without thinking about them. And I'm going to have you do a little exercise that it's hard to do on 1 and 2, but I'm going to start on 3. So I'm going to go 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, 1, 3, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1, 4, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1, 5, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1, 6, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 1, 7, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1, 8, 1. Then the next test that you should do is, can you do that without going through the process? 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 3, 1, 1, 4, 1, 1, 5, 1, 1, 6, 1, 1, 7, 1, 1, 8, 1. Those are the intervals of a major scale. Now, I want you to just trust me on this. A unison, an octave, a fourth, and a fifth are all called perfect intervals in a major scale. A unison, a fourth, a fifth, and the octave are called perfect. There's a reason they're called perfect, and I'm going to tangle myself up trying to explain this, but I think it's worth hearing a little bit. When you invert an interval, you flip it upside down. When you invert anything, you flip it upside down, okay? So the unison is hard to talk about, and the octave, it's the same note, so it's easy to. But my point is, when you go to the fourth, so F is in the C scale, correct? If you invert that, then the scale becomes an F scale. It goes F to C, F to C. So is a C in an F scale? It is, right? That's what makes it perfect, okay? If I go back to C scale and do the fifth, obviously G is in that C scale. If I invert that, I did that wrong. It would be G to C. So is a C in a G scale? G scale only has one sharp? It is, isn't it? Is a C in a C scale? Is a C in a C scale? Octave and unisons are given. Now so those are called perfect. Those are called perfect intervals. If I take an interval of a third, let's try that. That's a major third. It's called a major third. If I invert that and put the E on the bottom and the C on the top, is a C in an E scale? Mm-mm. F, C, G, D. We got 4 sharps. No, it's a C sharp. Okay? So the perfect intervals can be inverted, and they correspond in both directions. You just have to memorize. You can figure it out because it's obvious once you know how to figure it out. But you have to trust me on that. Then I made up this little saying about the major intervals. When they are inverted, subtract from 9 and change the sign. I think I wrote this up here somewhere, if I can find it. Here we go, intervals. Can you see this? Subtract from 9 and change the sign. You just have to memorize this. You just have to memorize this. You also just have to memorize, unless you want to figure this out on your own, that perfect, fourth, fifth, and octaves are perfect. In a major scale, you have a major second, a major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, a major sixth, a major seventh, although that's kind of half erased, and a perfect eighth. Okay? So do you understand, without a lot of worry and without going through the process of inverting these, if you inverted a major third, subtract from 9 and change the sign. A major third, 3 from 9, it goes from major to minor, and vice versa. So this will, I'm telling you this because I want you to understand how you get to minor and diminished and augmented intervals. Now there's something here that I wrote. A major interval goes down a half step and becomes minor. We just showed you that with the inverted third, that instead of a C sharp, it's a C natural. That becomes the minor sixth. You can also diminish an interval. And this is where you get into double sharps and double flats. If you went and we're going to play a minor 6 on that E, because it's not the C sharp, it's the C natural. But you want it to be a diminished 6 above that E in the scale of E, it would be an E to a C flat, which is harmonically a B. I've had people ask me over and over, why don't they just write a B instead of a C flat? Because there's a grammatical reason, just like you put a comma instead of a period in some places in literature. So you've got to understand the grammatical reasoning behind this, but that is why you end up with double flats or double sharps. Here's something else that you just have to memorize. Perfect intervals and major intervals can go up a half step and become augmented. If something is augmented, it's larger. A perfect interval of a fifth can go from C to G. You can go up to G sharp, and that is an augmented fifth, okay? You can go from C to A in a major sixth and go up a half step to A sharp, and that's an augmented sixth. Perfect intervals do not become minor. They can become diminished. Perfect intervals skip that minor spot. So a perfect fifth, if it went from C to G, could go down to G flat, it would be called a diminished fifth. If it went to G sharp, it would be called an augmented fifth. However, when you've got the major intervals, it goes through the minor process first on the way down. So C to A is a major sixth, C to A flat is a minor sixth, C to A double flat, remember we talked about these before, a double flat, it would be C to A double flat, would be a diminished sixth, the interval. Does that make sense to you? I think it's very logical if you can follow me. And I'm not promising that I've done the best job of explaining this. So I'm telling you to memorize a couple of things. A perfect fifth can become diminished, can become augmented. A major interval goes from major to minor to diminished, all headed down. A major interval goes up the half step to the augmented interval. And I think this will help you to understand part of why you see some strange things in music, and it will help you to sing these things. Now, I'm going to have a conversation with you. I'm going to ask you to open to your handout number 10. This is in your textbook, and this is the most confusing page in the textbook. It's page 122 and 123. It has examples of intervals. It has major seconds, minor seconds, going up, going down, all of the above. And if you can memorize all of these little songs, good for you. But as a teacher, I'm going to tell you this is way too much information. You need to use your head in some ways, and I'm going to give you another method that I think might help you in a better way. We worked on how to hear the intervals of a major scale, from going 1, 1, 1, 3, 1, 1, 4, 1, 1, 5. 1. I'm happy for you to use little songs like Chopsticks or Twinkle, Here Comes the Bride for the fourth, or Twinkle Twinkle for the fifth. What is the third? Doorbell, or Backwards Doorbell. Or there's another song for the fifth, Papa Haydn, Bum 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 Bum. You can use, or My Bonnie for the sixth, or seventh. A major seventh is a hard interval to find. The best thing I can find is you go to the octave and then down a half step. Bally High from South Pacific. There's your octave, and there's the seventh. Whoo, what an ugly sound. Anyway, I teach my kids it's just called ugly on the seventh. I think that if you can learn the major and perfect intervals of a major scale, you all should be able to sing down a half step or up a half step and determine. Now, I spent some time with Faith Ferry the other night, and I want to show you something that she showed me. I'll give her credit. And I don't know that you can learn this quite as easily without working it, and maybe we'll do this when and if we ever get back to rehearsals. But you know how I had you do 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, going up a major scale? If you come down a major scale, you're subtracting from 9 and changing the sign. 8, 7, 8, 7. That is now a minor second. It's 2 notes apart, 8, 7, subtract from 9 and change the sign. That is a minor second. That's a whole lot easier to me than learning 5 songs and forgetting which song goes with which interval, and that's just me. Okay, so you're going to go 8, 6, 8, 6. Instead of, you subtract from 9, 6 from 9 is 3, and instead of a major 6, it's now a minor 6. So if you can sing this, that's a minor third. Here we go. The perfect fourth doesn't change. It's still a perfect fourth. The perfect fifth doesn't change. It's still a perfect fifth in either direction. That's why it's called perfect. You get to 8, 3, 8, 3. Subtract from 9 and change the sign. Subtract from 9 is 3. And instead of a major third, it's now a minor third. Subtract from 9, the 7th, a minor 7th, and the perfect octave. So I think if you can go 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, 1, 6, 1, 7, 1, 8, 8, 7, 8, 6, 8, 5, 8, 4, 8, 3, 8, 2, 8, 1. You have the means to know every major and minor and perfect interval of a scale. And I think that's more useful than all of this. I'm not telling you that's wrong. It's not wrong. It's just too much information for most of us to recall quickly enough in a score to say, oh my gosh, oh, that goes to Frere Jacques upside down and in the middle of the piece. I can't do that. Anyway, I hope you understand a little bit more about intervals. Intervals. You just have to memorize some of this. You have to trust me on this. I think I've told you everything I want to and everything I know about that. There is something more about intervals that I think you need to know as singers. A combination of 2 notes that seem to blend well is called a consonance, or a consonant interval. Octaves and unisons are the most consonant intervals. The perfect fifth is also very consonant. You see how we keep coming back to the same information used in different formats. This is used, the fifth is there again used in tuning, chord progressions, harmonic progression, everything. Anyway, a combination of 2 notes that seem discordant is called a dissonance or a dissonant interval. And this is very subjective as intervals have become, more dissonant intervals have become more accepted as time goes by. Just like chromaticism was not part of what you think about Bach's music, although he did throw a few in every once in a while as part of what made his music so fabulous. But anyway, the dissonance and the consonant. There's a time that I will tell singers to lean on the dissonance in a piece and relax on the resolve of that. And that's because the ear, just like the leading tone, will take you home to where it wants to go. It wants to get out of that dissonance. So if you lean on that, the listener will connect with that and resolve it in their own brain before you can even perform it, which makes it more interesting to a listener. Dissonant intervals are generally located very close to consonants, okay? So dissonant intervals would be like, all right, let's do a minor second. Okay, we've said consonants are unison or an octave or even a fifth. A dissonant interval, I even say a second, but I'm going to do a minor second above middle C. That is really ugly because it's really close to this. Even a second, a whole step apart. Listen to the 7th, in the major 7th in a major scale. It's pushing you close to this octave. So it wants to go there. So that's really dissonant to hear. If you have the most dissonant interval, that I'm going to go read so I can make sure I tell you everything I want you to know about this, the most dissonant interval in music is called the tritone. It's called a tritone because it's made up of 3 whole steps. Starting note, whole step, whole step, whole. It's difficult to sing. something that I figured out along the way in writing this down is that a tritone is half of an octave. And I don't think I'd ever thought of it that way. It doesn't get any easier to sing the tritone. It was called the interval of the devil, and theorists would not allow it in the grammatical use, although it does happen from time. Diabolus in musica, the devil in music. The 3 whole steps, the tritone. It was strictly forbidden by music theorists. And because it's so difficult to sing, although we've sung it in some of our works, I generally will point those out to you because I think it's an interval that just is not a natural thing to sing, and it's one of those that you just have to spend time working on. From intervals, we create chords. From your text on page 106, a chord is a group of 3, 4, or more notes sounded at the same time, harmonically. That's harmonically. In vocal music, of course, we sing these notes consecutively as melodic intervals. Chords have a distinct sound. Once you learn to recognize these sounds, you will be able to read 3 or 4 notes, consecutive notes, in a chord without hardly thinking. Now, somewhere I have a chart. Let's see if I can find it. Right here, of chords. These are inversions. That's not what I want. Give me a second. Here we go. Triads, right here. 3-note chords are built on thirds. These little dots are representing pitches. A major chord has a starting note. It goes up 2 steps, or what is a major third, and then it has 1.5 steps, or a minor third. So if you could, each of these chords that we're going to discuss either have intervals of a major third or a minor third or some combination of that, okay? A major chord is the larger, the major third, then the minor. A minor chord is the smaller first and then the major. So the outside notes remain the same, but the inner note goes down a half step, which makes the first third a smaller third, a minor third. The second third, a major third. A diminished chord, if you diminish something, it's smaller. Everything about it's smaller. It's the 2 smaller intervals. So they're both minor third, minor third. An augmented chord is the 2 larger, major third and major third. It's so very logical to me. So, but listen to the difference in them. And here again, this is where you get some weird accidentals. Say I'm doing it on D major. D, F sharp, A is a major chord. To make that minor, the third goes down a half step. So it's 1.5 steps and then 2. To make it diminished, I've got 2 of the smaller, 2 of the 1.5s. Okay? To make it augmented, I'm go back to major because the first is the larger, the major third, and the second one becomes A sharp. Sounds like a train whistle to me. But that's an augmented chord. But if you just think the major, it tells you that on the first 2 notes of it. The minor gets a little smaller and tells you that on the first 2 notes. Diminished is both small, augmented is both large. You need to know what these chords sound like because many times in music, as singers, you are singing these chords broken into melodic lines. You know, you're singing that instead of doing this. Now, a four-part chorus altogether, harmonically, because people are singing different notes, are building chords this way, and we're building chords this way. So it works both ways in 4-part choral music or 8-part choral music or any choral music, anything that has more than 1 line. I want you to memorize these things. You just need to understand this. Also, a sign when you see this in a piece, major is represented by an uppercase M. Minor, a lowercase m. Diminished also often has just a little tiny circle, and augmented is plus because it's adding to it. Those are just some signs that you should understand. All triads are made up of 2 interlocking intervals of a third, and we just said that. Triads are built from the bottom up. The lowest note on which the thirds are built is called the root of the chord. The lowest note of a root position chord is a letter name of that chord. So I'm going to show you this. This would be a root position chord, C, E, G. Remember, the third is always a skip, the fifth is always a double skip. So that's a root position chord. Oftentimes as singers, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but oftentimes as singers, another note will be added to this, a 4-note chord. I call this an extended C major chord. Extended because the C from the bottom now is extended to the top. So it's a 4-note chord, but it's only involving 3 letters. It's C, E, G plus a C on the top. An extended position chord is what I call that. I made that up. I wouldn't take that to print, but I think it works. Often in warm-ups, there is your extended chord. That chord can be minor. It can be diminished, but it always adds the octave on top. There are other kind of 4-note chords. We have 7th chords. Let's see if I can turn and tell you about that. I'm getting into inversions already. Well, let me just tell you about 7th note chords just a little bit because I think they're interesting. You can add a 4-note chord and add another third on top of that. Do you understand that? And that can be called, and is often called, a dominant 7th chord. It's a chord that happens generally built on the dominant chord of the scale, which would be on the 5th note of the scale, and then it would add a minor third on top of that, and it would sound like this. And you'll hear that when we get to cadences. And the next thing I want to tell you is that there's another chord, and it can be a diminished 7th chord, which is built of all diminished thirds. We know what a diminished third is. A diminished 7th chord is all diminished thirds. So there are many chords, but the main chords you're going to sing and recognize would be the major, minor, augmented, diminished, and 7ths will be there as well. Now, when you draw a chord, this is called root position with a skip, skip, skip. If you invert a chord, just like we inverted intervals, we shifted them around some, this C can go up top. That's called position of the 1. My point is that this is still C, E, G chord. That is still a C chord, but with the E on the bottom, the median on the bottom, it is called the first inversion. First inversion. What I want you to take out of these inversions is that it's still a C chord. It's still a C major chord. And the other thing I want you to take is that you have a skip on the bottom, and then you have a 4th between that. Remember, a skip is always line to line, to the next line, or space to space, and then the 4th is always a line and a space with a small separation. In a second inversion chord, the top note is now the bottom note. It's still a C, E, G chord, but it's all mixed up. Well, the G's on the bottom, the C, and then the E, or these can be, it can go up an octave if you want to, but the note on the bottom, being a G, or being the 5th note of that root position chord, is creating a second inversion chord. Now look at the interval you see here. It's a 4th, and then the skip is between the top 2 notes. I drew these harmonically, they take less room, but you can draw these out melodically, sort of like what I've done over here. And you can spy them as singers. If you see 3 skips in a row, that's a root position chord. It's your job to determine whether it's major, minor, augmented, or diminished. But that gives you a hint of where you are. What I would tell you in your scores, when you find a skip to skip to skip, or when you find melodically a skip and then a 4th, I circle that and I say, so what letter name is that? Well, what letter name would that be? In this case, it's C, E, G. You have to get your alphabet into skip, skip, skip form in order to identify what that chord is. You should circle that chord, write the scale degree of the chord in your score, and then it will help you to, whether it's middle, top, bottom. I put some little examples here. What chord would this be? F sharp, A, D. Well, if I'm going up the alphabet, A, B, C, D, that's 4 notes apart. That won't work. So if I start on a D, D, E, F, G, A. So that's some sort of a D chord because I've got the letters in thirds, which is what's required. So this would be a D chord. It's a major chord because it has the F sharp in it, which gives me the major third between the first two notes. I would circle that, put D major, D with an upper M, and then I'd put 3, 5, 1 beside that. That's the third note of the chord, the middle note of the chord, the top note of the chord, and 1. Middle, top, bottom. I say to piano students, but as singers, I would ask you to put 3, 5, 1, which will help you to identify that as your sight reading. Does that make sense? Practice this. I've got to keep going. Oh, I want to tell you about this handout, number 8. Number 8 is your handout, and it's building a chord on every note of the scale. And it's in your book on page 111. And I think if you look at this, you will understand, but I want you to see it up here as well. We're going to build a chord out of the melodic notes of a major scale, okay? So we're going to build a chord on the tonic, which is the 1, using the scale degrees or the melodic vocabulary of the major scale. You're going to build a major chord. When you build a note on the supertonic or the second degree of the scale, it is a minor chord. Use this pattern over here. It's 1.5 steps plus 2 full steps, and that creates a minor chord. The median creates a minor chord. The subdominant creates a major chord. The dominant, there you go, the 1, 4, and 5. You see there again, relating to intervals that were perfect. The 1, 4, and 5 create major chords when you're just using the notes of a scale. Okay? When you get to the seventh note of the scale, and if I'm using a C scale, there's a major chord, only using white notes. Built on the second note is a minor chord, minor. A 4th is a major, 5 is major, 6 is minor. 7th chord, using the notes of a major scale, is a diminished chord, an A. I also want to tell you, and I don't know if I have enough fingers to cover this, that's partly why 1, 4, and 5 are so important in major keys, because they're called primary chords. They keep the sound of the piece in a major tonality because they're major chords. When you flip into 2s and 6s and even into that diminished chord on the 7th, it kind of floats around, funky tonality. Sometimes I'd call that makes it more interesting, but whatever. I also want to show you one little trick. If you play a 1 chord, major, a 4 chord, major, and a 5 chord, which is G, B, D. I've covered every note of the major scale. So whatever melodic note you're going to use, you can use one of those 3 primary chords or one of those 3 major chords to cover that. So you need to just memorize that. When I was in high school, everyone wanted to play the guitar. And somehow I ended up with a guitar. I learned 3 chords, a 1 chord, a 4 chord, and a 5 chord. And I could play most any tune. You can harmonize almost anything with those 3 chords. I could only play in 1 key. I could do it by ear, but it was only 3 chords. 1 chord, 4 chord, and 5 chord. Cadences are short. Let's do it. Let's do it quick. We won't do sight reading today. We'll do a lot of sight reading next time, though. Cadences are quick. A cadence is a chord progression that ends a piece of music. A section of a piece or even a phrase. There are several different cadences. They will sound familiar to your ear, but better understanding will help you to interpret each cadence. Most common cadence is the perfect cadence. I'm going to move this so I can be as fast as possible. The most common cadence is the perfect one. It's called the perfect cadence. It moves from 5 to 1, okay? 5, 1. It's the major chord built on the dominant of the scale, and it goes 1. If I add the 7th to that, it even pushes me closer to home. So that is called a perfect cadence, all right? Easy. You see it up there? Memorize it. A plagal cadence is a 4-1. It's known as the amen cadence. An amen cadence, you know, we don't sing amens in church like we used to sing amens at the end of every hymn. But if I did, and here's a 4 chord, that's a 4 going to 1. It's called a plagal cadence. Memorize it. Think about amen. A deceptive cadence. Oh, let's see if I can do this. A deceptive cadence goes from 5 to some other place. It usually goes to a 6 chord. Well, remember, where am I? A 6th chord in a major scale is a minor chord. How surprising is that? Okay? I have to think about where I am. 5, 5, 7. That's a deceptive, and then you can go back and go back to your perfect cadence to get to the final. But a deceptive cadence can take you somewhere else, but it's kind of interesting to use every once in a while. There is an imperfect cadence. It goes from 1 to 5. That is usually not something that happens at the end of a piece, but happens in the middle of a piece, where a piece kind of modulates, as we talked about, into a different key. It would take it to the dominant. It goes from the tonality that you're in into the dominant tonality, or based on the 5 chord, and then it stays there. Sonata Allegro form is a perfect example of where this happens a lot. We'll talk about forms in another class, but we'll, I want you to know that that exists. 2 more things I want to say. Rhythmic alteration. Some composers, and I think Brahms does this as much as anyone I know, but he doubles the value of the final cadence. So, what could I play? I mean, Christmas. You see what I did? I just took it and doubled the value of every note, and it takes me home. You know? So there's one other thing I got to tell you about, and it's called a Picardy third. It's kind of a fun thing. If it's overused, it's so tacky I can't stand it. But you can do it in the same piece. A Picardy third, or tierce de Picardy, is also creates some deception as a part of the cadence I wrote. It is a device used when the piece is composed in a minor key, but the very final chord, rather than ending on the minor triad, sharpens the middle, or the median, and makes it a major chord. Let's see if I can do it. I'll do it. A little bit of that goes a long way. It's a little on the schmaltzy side. Let me tell you about next session, because I've talked too much. I had hoped that we would do some more sight singing today, and we will certainly get back to that. In fact, I'm thinking about having a whole class on just sight singing. And I've put up something up here about sight reading, the seven ways to prepare yourself for sight reading. We'll get back to that because it's important. The next 2 sessions, Robin Rockline, who is a professor at University of South Florida and at University of Tampa teaching voice, and who is our mezzo soloist most often with TOS, is going to be leading a class. And she's going to work in diction, both Latin and English, and in vocal technique and vocal quality. So I'm very excited that she will be recording 2 sessions with us for the ones that follow this. For the next class, you will need handout number 12, which is Latin pronunciation. handout number 13, which is English vowel and consonant chart. Text page 128 to 132 has pronunciation of the Roman Mass and the Roman Requiem. So I'd want you to make sure you have your book for that. Read page 49 to 53. Have a great week. Amen.